Hi, everyone. This is Bobby Eagle with PRSA Tampa Bay, and I want to welcome everyone to today's session to review some best practices around the PRSA Tampa Bay Prestige Awards. And we'll start off by turning the call over to Mike Flanagan to introduce himself.
Thanks, Bobby. Yeah, this is Mike Flanagan. I'm a board member for the PRSA Tampa Bay chapter, and I'm with a PR agency called LDWW Group, and I head up our business with Carnival Corporation, the world's largest cruise company.
Very good, and thanks, Mike. And as I said before, this is Bobby Eagle. I'm a member of the PRSA Tampa Bay leadership team and have been for a number of years. I'm currently the Global Public Relations Director for Cineverse, a mobile technology company, and serve on an annual basis as a judge for the National PRSA Silver Anvil Awards. So, again, really wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. We're really pleased to be continuing the momentum that we found with the PRSA Tampa Bay Prestige Awards. It's a program that's been designed in the model of the National Silver Anvil Awards. And in our session today, Mike and I really want to share how you can create a stronger entry to stand out from the crowd. So here's what we'll cover. First, we'll cover how to select your best work to enter. We'll cover tips for completing the required sections in the two-page entry summary, along with the backup information that everyone must submit. In addition, we'll share an overview of the judging process so you can put yourself in the shoes and act on what they, the shoes of the judges, and act on what they seek in a strong entry. I'll also walk you through the entry process from a judge's perspective, and Mike will share some advice and insights from his experience putting together a Silver Anvil and Best of Silver Anvil winning entry on behalf of Carnival Corporation. We plan to leave quite a bit of open discussion between the two of us to kind of go through experiences, and so we'll make sure that we cover a lot of what you can expect as you go through the journey. So let's get started. The first step, of course, is selecting your best work to enter. And really, you can't have a great entry without first doing great work. And your campaign should be able to tell a complete and a compelling story using the sections required of every single PRSA Prestige Award entry, which are research, planning, execution, and evaluation. So from there, Mike, we talked about how the Prestige Awards are designed in the model of the Silver Anvils. So how and why did you decide to enter the Silver Anvils and the Prestige Awards for your campaign for Carnival?
Thanks, Bobby. Yeah, the four-step process was where we began, and we went through that as a checklist, and that really helped us determine that we had an entry that we thought had a chance, and it was worthy of going through the process and the fees that's associated with it. We felt that we met all of the criteria, that we had a good story to tell. We had done upfront research, and we came up with goals that are measurable, and a good solid execution, and most importantly, we felt we had pretty good results. So that all came together, and we also dealt with the issue of one of the questions is about budget, and we actually had a relatively small budget, but we felt like that was not as important as the actual work, product, and results. And once we went through that four-step process, we felt like, okay, let's give this a go.
Perfect. So how did you work with your client and your team to determine how to tell your story in the two-page summary? That is really a significant portion of the challenge, is telling a compelling, clear story that captures those four categories in the two-page summary. And then how much time did you allow for the entry process overall?
Yeah, that was actually this upfront piece is we found really valuable. I think that all of us at one time or another have done some awards, and we just kind of say, okay, let's do this, and you just maybe individually you go ahead and you do it, and somebody reviews it in that process, and that can work. But for this one, we really felt like, okay, this might have something to it. So we said, let's try and step back, and we actually held a meeting with our client and we went through that four-step process. We went over the, all of the elements of what we had gone through in the campaign. And, we really had some good discussion, and, we took good notes. And, from that, we were able to really pull together an outline for what we thought could form the basis of the entry form. So there was some upfront additional work that we put into it. It was great to actually take the time to talk together as a team about it. Oftentimes, we're just, there's a lot coming at us, and we don't sometimes take the time to do something like that. And we really found that was valuable. And as part of that process, we also put in a timeline. And we made sure that we had enough time allocated for the actual writing of the first draft, the review process. We actually put in that we would have a meeting to actually talk about what the first draft looked like and how that was shaping up. And we found that very valuable too. And then, of course, allowing time to put together additional background information and a couple more review times for review. So, we did put in some extra time into it, Bobby, but I think at the end of the day, it really helped us flesh out all of the things that were really relevant, helped us capture some points that maybe we might not have captured or thought of if we had not taken that time. And I think it really made a difference in the final product of the actual application.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense, Mike. I think in having been a judge, not only for the Prestige Awards, but also for the Silver Emeralds, I think you can definitely tell the entries where the applicant has really put in that kind of time and energy, and it really pays off. It just absolutely does. Which I think makes this a great time to look at the program overall and the ways to enter and how to think about approaches with your work. As we move to the next slide, the Prestige Awards have two types of entries. Programs recognize the best public relations campaigns, while products recognize the best tactics. And it's important to reinforce here that putting together entries requires advanced planning and time, like Mike said. This is not easy to do in a few days, especially for programs. I just can't reiterate that enough. As you think about what a campaign is, it's really something that involves multiple tactics and strategies executed over a period of time. It's something that has measurable objectives as well as evaluations that looks back at those objectives to determine how effective the campaign was overall. And we'll talk more about those in particular here in a little bit. If the work that you did that you were entering for an award relied specifically on one main tactic, first and foremost, great. These awards are all about recognizing great work. But if it relied on that one main tactic, like media relations outreach, or if you had a great tactic like an annual report, a speech, an internal e-newsletter, you should really consider entering that as a product rather than a campaign. And that's why we keep the two categories separate from one another, because we want to make sure that all great work is recognized in its own right. Once you've decided on what to enter, you'll find that there are actually 13 different program categories and 11 product categories to choose from that we have on the next slide. It may seem overwhelming, but it's fairly easy to choose if you keep in mind your program's goals and the type of organization you're submitting on behalf of. So Mike, you entered Carnival in several categories. What was the process that you went through, and how did you decide what categories were best for you to enter?
Sure. The process for us was, as you said, Bobby, pretty straightforward. We looked at what we were really trying to accomplish as a program, and there were really two things. One was, at the time, the company was in crisis mode. So this, I think, naturally fell into the category of crisis communication. So that was one of the categories. The broader goal, though, was not just to manage the crisis as well as we could, but it was also to focus on the recovery of the brand and reputation of the company. And when we looked at what we were trying to accomplish in those two areas, we felt pretty comfortable that we had the two categories that we really wanted to focus on and that were the right fit for what we wanted to do. So that's how we did it, Bobby, was basically looking at what the, what was the primary goal of the program. And in this case, we really had, it was on two tracks. And it was really important to identify the right categories because, as you say, if you go into a category that's a little bit off track, then I think the judges will see right through that, and it could hurt your entry.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Mike, and brings up one other really important point related to categories, which is that judges can't move entries if they feel that they're in the wrong category, and so you'll be rated on the category that you selected. That is exactly why it is so critical to make sure you choose the most appropriate category from the start. Otherwise, if you stay in a category and are reviewed against that category but are not a fit, it just makes it really, really difficult to compete against the other entries within that category and really hurts your chances at coming out with a successful entry. So really, really making sure that you pay close attention to the call for entry document, which does a really good job of describing each category. So now that you've picked your best work in the right category, let's discuss the entry itself. Prestige awards require a two-page summary like we've talked about, and I always advise to spend about 80 to 90% of your time and effort here, and that's specifically because it is also where the judges spend most of their time when they're reviewing your entry, and when I say most, I mean substantially most. You want to make sure that your two-page summary is both compelling so that it tells an impactful story and cohesive so that all the parts and the pieces are fitting together. On top of that, you got to make sure that it's clear and avoid industry jargon. If you're using a bunch of initialisms or acronyms or abbreviations that are specific to your industry, it's going to be particularly challenging for the judges to follow what you're describing, so make sure you're clear. From there, the two-page summary has 5 key sections. There's the background or situation analysis, and then the 4 we talked about previously: research, planning, execution, and evaluation. And those will sound familiar if you've gone through the public relations accreditation process. And we're going to walk through each section, and Mike is going to share how he put together each section, and I'll provide some tips as a judge for things to look out for. So each entry should start with a situation analysis. This is an upfront paragraph or two, and underscore that, paragraph or two, so just, make very good use of that little bit of space. It sets up the business challenge and what you or your client faced. It paints the big picture for the judges and gives them a reason to continue reading. That's something to always think about as you're going through the entry, as you write it. Make sure that you're being compelling and giving the judges a reason to keep reading. I mentioned that the judges spend substantially all of their time on your two-page summary, and interestingly, one of the things I like to look at the two-page summary is doing is you put a lot of work into the things that you include in the appendix, but you need to give the judges a reason to go actually take a look at it. It needs to be clear up front what the overall takeaways are so that they can go look at the appendix items more as supplement and not something that the entry itself is dependent upon. So, Mike, the situation at Carnival was serious and certainly a challenge. So tell us about that particular situation and how you framed the situation analysis for your entry.
Sure, Bobby. So, it was a serious situation. In fact, part of the recovery was focused on a ship that had been damaged off the coast of Italy, and very unfortunately 32 people died. So as you said, a very serious situation there. That was followed about a year later by a ship that was stranded in the Gulf of Mexico, and because of a fire, and the ship lost its power, and which also affected a lot of the basic services on board, including many of the bathrooms. And so for about 4 days, the ship was stranded, and some of the TV outlets sent helicopters, and they were getting live video of it. Some of the passengers started to put up signs called, "Save us from the poop cruise," and that sort of became what it was known as. And so, it was just kind of like one thing after another. So we put that right up front. We didn't, take our time to get into it. That was like in our first sentence, and how that really shook consumer confidence in the company and its cruise line brands, and talked about how much impact there was, a negative impact on the company, how bookings had dropped, revenue went down, and the reputation of the company had gone down by as much as 50 points at its lowest point. So we really just laid that out there to, as you said, Bobby, from a judge's perspective. If you're reading this, and we kind of looked at it from a judge's perspective, you look at this, you're saying, holy cow, there's a lot of difficult things going on with this company. We added a couple more things about how there was some churn going on with the leadership, a change in CEO, and then a new chief communications officer was brought in. So, there was just, these very difficult incidents that had happened, and then there was some churn within the leadership organization. So again, one of the things we really looked at, having a couple of us had served as judges as well, was we really did look at it from a judge's perspective, and what was really going to grab a judge's attention, what could you do to really make the story and what you were facing as compelling as possible, and as so that they could really see the challenge of it. And that's what we did, Bobby. And I think when we put that all together, I think it really caught a lot of the attention of the judges.
And that's really what that's all about, is making sure you capture that attention in the situation analysis right up front. Make it abundantly clear to the judges exactly what was going on that necessitated the campaign that subsequently you have entered for the award. So that brings us to the next section, which is research. And this may also be a few paragraphs, and it shares the basis of your campaign. It's why you did what you did. So within this section, you share the primary and the secondary research that you did or used to develop a SMART campaign. This is an extremely important section, and they all are for sure. This is really the foundation of again, why you did what you did. It can be a challenging portion of the summary to put together, especially because often there's quite a bit of research that goes into something, both primary and secondary. Sometimes you may have surveys, sometimes you may have media content analyses, all kinds of different things. And Mike, I imagine that you all had copious amounts of potential research to share in there. So what research data did you use and include in your campaign in this section, and how were you able to position it? I mean, goodness, for such an intricate campaign to cover that much in a section of a two-page summary has got to be a huge challenge. So how did you really go about tackling that?
Yeah, that was really difficult, and I think you again were right on point here. The tendency, I think, is to focus a lot on, well, look at all the great things we did, into the execution of it. So we really had to go all the way back to the beginning when we first came in and we began working with the Chief Communications Officer. And really, we went back to that to say, okay, here's what when we knew we were in a difficult situation, and we're saying, okay, well, how bad is it? We wanted to quantify it as much as we could, Bobby, and we fell back onto that. So that was very helpful. And one of the things that we found was there's an organization called YouGov, and they do a brand index study, and it's actually free, and so but it's also very credible, and it's often referenced in a lot of reporting and different kinds of reports. Which is a point to make is that sometimes you can find free or inexpensive resources for research online, or with different organizations. And, it's worth, taking a look at seeing what might be out there. That was very helpful to us because it really gave us a benchmark. We found that the company's brand reputation fell as much as 50 points by the middle of 2013. And the YouGov Brand Index also tracks purchase consideration, and found that the purchase consideration fell to about 15, which was about 20 points lower than the rest of the industry, which is a lot of ground to make up. So that was something that we had done way before we ever thought about, before we ever did anything, much less started putting together an entry. So we went back to that. The other thing was before we began anything, we said we need to do an analysis of the share of voice in terms of quantity, but also tone. And so we found a software provider. There's several out there. We found one that was very reputable, and we launched into that to see exactly where things stood for the company in terms of share of voice. And that reflected, as you can imagine, a very negative sentiment. And, there was a high amount of quantity, but it was largely negative. So, right away we saw that we had to turn around the negative and start, we had to stop that and increase the positive. So, which also led us into another goal of the campaign, was to change the conversation and to begin focusing on, okay, we addressed the incidents that happened. Here's what we did to address those, and then to focus on the turnaround of what was going on with the company to move on from those incidents and continue to get back on a positive track. So, along with that, from the share of voice research, we found that there were about 30 different media outlets that were really driving a substantial part of the news media. And so that was another part of our research that yielded some good information, so that it allowed us to focus on, we were focused on as many media as possible, but we had a much sharper focus on those 30 media and cultivating closer relationships with them and really being very proactive with them. So,
interestingly, Mike, I think clearly you covered a lot of ground in terms of the types of research you did. Were there any particular tips or experiences as you went through the process of the two-page summary in terms of how you brought all that to light in such a tight space?
Yeah, I tell you, what it really was, Bobby, was highlighting those benchmarks and putting a little bit of color, a little bit of context around those benchmarks for the judges. So, the reputation falling by 50, the purchase consideration going 20 points below the rest of the industry, the 30 media really driving a lot of the negative, and then also the social media component too, right? So we identified where a lot of the social media negative chatter was coming from too. And the final point was that the corporate website was basically out of date and was really serving mainly as a site for investor relations. All of the brands for the company have very robust websites, but the corporation itself did not. So, Bobby, it was really, those were the weak spots that we identified, and we highlighted those for the judges. And what that really did for us, Bobby, was that gave us a game plan for being able to go into the next four-step, the next step in the four-step process, which was the planning and establishing goals.
I think what's so fascinating about all of this is the fact that if you think about the construct of these awards, and certainly they are designed this way very deliberately because it's directly aligned with the public relations accreditation process. But what's so fascinating is that if you start to take the approach to your own communication strategies that is taken to how these awards are laid out, it's amazing the impact that it can have on ensuring that strategic approach, because all the things that you're describing, Mike, and we'll certainly talk a little bit more about them in a minute, really helped to make sure that you had a very effective and strategic approach to addressing some of the challenges. So it's really, really an important thing to note. As we move on, in thinking about the judge's perspective, I think one tip that I have is to not only tell the judges what research you did or what you learned, but also what it meant for your campaign or the goals. So it's not simply, such and such percent consumer preference or whatever, but really saying, okay, this told us that we should do X, Y, or Z. So it's showing and telling the cause and effect. And this will help connect the dots for the judges and make sure that your entry is more cohesive. One of the things that's a great benefit of any PRSA Silver Anvil Award winner like Mike's is that perpetually the two-page summary is available on the PRSA.org website. And certainly I would encourage anyone to go check out Mike's entry for Carnival Corporation and take a look at how he and his team were able to really succinctly and compellingly cover some of these items in their two-page summary, especially the research, given how much there was to be covered there. So that brings us to the next section, as Mike alluded to, which is planning. And this is where most of the entries are the weakest, to be honest with you. This section should demonstrate what you set out to do. So it should include 4 things: measurable goals, strategies, target audience, and budget. Let me say those one more time, because all 4 of those are absolutely critical. Measurable goals, strategies, target audience, and budget. And I would say do yourself and the judges a huge favor and make sure that the objectives are both measurable and quantifiable. And we'll talk more about that in a minute, because it's just so critically important to a successful entry. Not only a successful entry, but as I was mentioning, also a successful campaign as well. So, Mike, you alluded to some of these earlier on. Tell us a little bit more about the objectives that you outlined in your entry, as well as the strategies put into place.
Sure. So, through that process that we did before we ever began the campaign, where we identified, how challenging the situation was, we were able to identify certain benchmarks as to how challenging it was. That really gave us an opportunity to go through and say, okay, we know that we need to improve our brand reputation. And so the next step was, how much do you improve it by? And so, we really went through a process there where, okay, you don't want to sandbag and go too low. You don't want to, overpromise and, set a goal that may be not reachable. So we really had a lot of good discussion back and forth as to what that goal should be. And what we came up with was, we thought it was realistic to improve brand reputation by 50%. There were some who thought that was shooting way too high. There were some brand experts that said it would take 3 or 4 years for the company's brand to recover, and maybe even longer. So, we felt like we put ourselves on the line with that, but we maybe just being optimistic and wanting to stem the tide, we felt like it was a good stake to put in the ground. So,
and on that point, Mike, just really quickly, because we talked about the importance of it being measurable, and you mentioned the goal of improving your brand reputation by 50%. You measured that, and you called out in your entry specifically that was going to be measured by YouGov. Is that correct?
That's right, Bobby.
Yeah, I think that's important to make sure if you're going to say how much you want to improve a brand reputation, or one of the terms I see all the time in entries is increase awareness. There needs to be a clear measure of how you're going to do that. So increasing awareness is not necessarily media mentions, but rather, and awareness is a tough thing to measure, but you really have to look at how do you want to measure it. And a lot of times that comes down to pre and post campaign surveys if you're looking at awareness.
Yeah, absolutely. You definitely need some sort of credible measurement factor to be able to substantiate that. 100%, Bobby. And having that YouGov brand index, that was something we said, okay, Well, there's our measurement factor. The second goal was pretty clear to us, was we needed to, reduce the amount of negative press coverage and social media around the situation, around the company. And there again, we were getting hammered, basically. So we thought it was a very good goal, not an easy goal, to reduce the negative share of voice by 50%. So, and we now had a system in place, a software system in place to be able to measure that. So that would be able to be substantiated as well. The third goal was one where we relied on that YouGov Brand Index, which is measuring consumers and their purchase consideration. And, this is often a difficult place for public relations professionals to operate in, to have that kind of impact. But what we felt was if we can improve the brand reputation and we can reduce the negative share of voice and increase the positive share of voice, that it should have a positive impact on the consumer's perspective of wanting to go on a cruise on Carnival Corporation ships. So we actually put in as a goal of contributing to 10% increase in purchase consideration. So, I think that having those three goals right under the planning section, Bobby, I think that really did make an impression on the judges. And then we followed that up, as you said earlier, with sharing some of the strategy that we would do to help reach those goals. And we kept those pretty tight, Bobby, but we had 4 goals that we called out. And I think those really were the goals that we had come up with before we ever began the campaign, and they definitely stood the test of time, and it was great to be able to pull back on our original planning to be able to bring those into the actual application.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable. And you talked about, as you were going through that, some advice for folks to determine and or create those measurable goals when they're initially planning their programs. And it's so important. And it's hard to find that balance for sure in terms of working with your leadership and working with, your various stakeholders to set realistic goals that will achieve the impact that you need. And really just thinking back or thinking ahead to the judge's tip, I would say that by far the most important tip is for applicants to make the goals measurable, like we talk about on the next slide. I mean, if your campaigns do not include measurable objectives, you just really will not be able to evaluate your campaign, plain and simple. So for example, if an entry states that if one of its goals is to build awareness, like we were talking about, if you don't give any specifics, the judges can't really tell how you're defining or measuring success. Again, keeping in mind, awareness is a very difficult thing to measure and typically requires pre- and post-campaign surveys. And numbers of media clippings do not necessarily equate to that type of measurement. So if this is all you have, you should really consider a different objective than awareness. I would say that's probably the objective I see most often in entries. I'm sure you've seen the same, Mike. Which brings us to the third section, which is execution. And this is where most of the entries do their best because it shares all the tactics and things that you did that went into your campaign. You're telling the judges what you actually did. And interestingly, I would say the more successful entries that you find typically of the 4 sections, they're all fairly evenly balanced in terms of length and content. And this is just kind of a general rule, but typically when you run into an entry that uses, let's say, a page and a half with a 2-page summary for execution, it's typically fair to say or fair to expect that it will not score as highly simply because there hasn't been enough time or space or consideration given to the other 4 sections. So bringing it back to your example, Mike, your campaign had many different tactics and action steps over the course of a year. How did you organize this section and decide what to include and what to leave out? you know, conceivably the things to leave out has got to be just as difficult a decision as what to leave in.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that, Bobby. And like we've been talking about, this is where you represents a large body of work, and you kind of want to put everything in the kitchen sink into it. So you really do have to take a step back and really focus on the elements that you think really made a difference in achieving your goals. And that was the process that we went through. And, it was difficult, but it was, I think that goes back to why it was so helpful for us to talk about what we wanted to do as a team early on before we ever began writing one word of this application, because we actually were going through each of the 4 steps, and we began having that conversation among, there was only 3 or 4 of us, but at least we were getting that out into the open and really having some conversation about it. And I was writing it, but then, I was getting input from our client and from a couple of my colleagues. And I think that really made a difference in being able to zero in on the elements that made a difference in the campaign. And so I think we came up with a brief intro, Bobby, and then 5 bullets. And by going, I think each of those 5 bullets and the intro, I think, were the things that made a difference. And I think the judges were able to tell that because it really laid out the execution of the strategy very clearly. And I think it all flowed very logically for the judges, and they could see, for instance, one of the items was carefully cultivating relationships with the 30 global media outlets that were creating a lot of the negative noise. So, right there, they could see that was a big focus for us. And so I think that being able to bring everything back to what your research identified, to what you wanted to do in your planning, and just trying to match up the execution of what you're doing to be able to accomplish the goals that you set, I think that's really what the judges are looking for.
Yeah, and I think what you've specifically described there is the impact, showing the impact and the things that really help to move the needle and that ladder directly up to the objectives that you've set, which is just so critical. Sometimes the hardest part of an entry is simply keeping the execution section brief while achieving that level of impact. Another pitfall in entries is just including a laundry list of tactics. You see that so many times where you really just want to make sure you give some color commentary that will really help the judges understand what you did and how it was smart or creative. So in other words, creating some cohesion from tactic to tactic. Another tip is to logically arrange the execution section. So organizing what you did according to each strategy, time frame, or audience, for example, and showing how they ladder back up to your objectives. The more cohesion you can have in a 2-page summary, the better for the judges, because they'll be able to see specifically not only what was the strategy of the campaign, but also how it was linked from an end-to-end perspective, from the very start to the very final section, which brings us to the final section of evaluation. And as we like to say, this is really the evil twin sister of the planning section that many, many people struggle with. This is where you prove to the judges exactly how you know you succeeded. You should really share your results against your stated objectives, and when you get to this portion of the entry, it'll become painfully clear why you needed to have measurable, quantifiable objectives. And unfortunately, many entries have vague results, or the results aren't related to the stated goals. And if you think back to what I said about media clippings not actually measuring awareness, if you said you wanted to raise awareness and all you've got to show on evaluation are media clippings, then the mark has been missed. And so, and the other thing that comes up into play with all of this is sometimes entries fail to address all of the stated upfront goals, which is a big challenge, and it really leaves the judge with an unclear picture as to how or whether you were successful in the campaign that's been entered. So Mike, how did you share your results in this section specifically? Again, with so much to cover, you know, there's such a wealth of content you could have shared. How did you share your results in this section, and what type of information did you include for the judges to assess how your campaign performed against those measurable objectives?
Well, I tell you what, on this part, I think here's what we found was true, was if you go through the process the way that we've talked about it, and you are able to establish very tangible goals that can be substantiated, then what you really have is it kind of writes itself. And what really will separate you from, you know, getting due recognition is, you know, what were the results against the goals that you set out to accomplish. So basically, Bobby, we took our goals and we put them into the evaluation. And, you know, obviously one of our goals was to increase brand reputation by 50%. And the really awesome news here was that the YouGov Brand Index said that the brand reputation had improved by almost 90%, which was just extraordinary. And so we were able to put that in. You know, we aimed for 50 and we almost doubled it. So, you know, that's a great result. Another goal was to reduce negative share of voice by 50%. And we were able to reduce it by 75%. So, you know, that was another significant overachievement of a goal. And what was also great was, you know, being able to, and we actually exceeded the 10-point increase in purchase consideration. It was actually 16-point increase. So that was about 60% over that goal. So from a public relations standpoint, you know, that was just tremendous. What was also helpful, I think, for the judges was we were able to bring in some color because the YouGov Brand Index actually wrote about this improvement, and they said some really good things about the recovery, and we actually quoted the publication, and that was really, I think, another thing that I think helped the judges understand, or give it, I guess it gave it credibility, Bobby, for, you know, this outside publication, totally independent, to really be able to say some things about what was achieved. They even said that it recovered to its previous perception levels and took half the amount of time it took both BP and Toyota with their respective problems. So, you know, I think looking out, you know, into, you know, other sources, and I mean, in this case, you know, we just didn't settle on the actual percentages, but we took the time to see what YouGov was saying, and we were actually able to incorporate that into this section of the application, and I think that really made a difference. And then we included about 3 or 4 other bullets on, you know, the share of voice improvement and how that, you know, we gave some examples of that. And then at the very end, we actually included another quote from the YouGov Brand Index talking about how its sales potential with consumers has rebounded above the rest of the cruise sector. So again, we mined that for everything that we could, Bobby, and I think it really helped. The final thing that we did was we actually put in 2 bullets on the company's overall financial results in 2014 versus 2013, which is when we began our work. And I think that just sort of was the icing on top of the cake for the judges. So when you put it all together, it really came together nicely. But I'll go back to how I started this part of the session was, having everything done, having gone through the process up front, really made this section pretty easy. Again, like I said, the only thing that really makes a difference is obviously if you can get really strong results. And if you can, then I think you have a shot at being recognized. And if our results had been, we had matched our results, not, exceeded them significantly, or we had come close, maybe somebody else would have beat us out, Bobby. So I think obviously the results of your work come through, but I think that keeps back to the point that you keep saying, Bobby, is that's the value of really looking to have tangible, measurable results. And if you can do that and you can achieve those, then I think you really have a chance of having your work recognized.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That is exactly right. And that's what this part of the entry is there to do, is in order for you to make those results and the impact that you had stand out and shine. And it's funny, Mike, as you mentioned and did, the easiest and best tip I can give to the judge is so simple. It's copy and paste. Literally copy your stated goals from your planning section and paste them here verbatim. Then all you've got to do is simply go back in and report your results. It completely removes the guesswork for the judge. There's no requirement of sitting there and looking where someone put in their results and going back up to the top of their two-page summary to the objectives and trying to figure out, well, how does this support that? You make it simple. You make it so that the judge can't ignore the success that you achieve. And also make sure that you don't miss sharing any results based on your upfront goals. And if you only give a bulleted list of results or media placements, it's very frustrating to a judge to know that there were 3 stated goals, but then have to figure out which results support which goal. And, it's so true that the quickest way to not win an award is to frustrate your judges. Just make it so simple, just like Mike described. And again, I encourage and will continue to encourage, go take a look at Mike's 2-page summary on the website. It is a great example of how to go about doing this. So that covers the 2-page summary and the crux of your entry for programs. You also need to submit PDFs with the relevant documents and information to support each of the 4 sections. And this is the appendix I mentioned before. You're allowed about 200+ pages for each section, so way more than enough, and more than you'll probably ever need, and importantly, more than the judges will ever read. This is a lot of space for supplementary content, and this can really seem daunting for people, and justifiably so. So, Mike, what did you and your team do for the backup information? Any tips for gathering and deciding what to include and how to make sure it's particularly supportive of the entry?
Yeah, so, this was another situation where all along we were monitoring the progress of what was going on, and especially when it came to press coverage and some of the social media content. So on a monthly basis, we were monitoring that, collecting that, and documenting it basically. And so when it came time to provide some backup support, we actually had a significant amount of information that we could pull together into a single document for the judges, and that really helped. So, and it also saved a lot of time, instead of having to go back and try to capture a lot of the news stories, for instance. We had been doing that all along in the process, and of course, that was very helpful to us as we went along, because it gave us good visibility as to what was going on with the media. And our client was able to share it internally with his CEO and leadership team, and he could actually show him the momentum that was building. So, we did all that not for the entry. We did that, because we thought it was the right, it was good for our practice to be able to capture all of that. So, so that just kind of fell into our laps, Bobby, because we were doing it anyway, and I'm guessing that, a lot of people were doing that as well. But I think one of the things that was helpful here was we were really able to put together a pretty impressive collection of stories from major outlets and such. And I think that I think if you have a really good entry and everything comes together nicely, and you get the judges saying, hey, this is pretty good, and then they look at a PDF and they say, wow, look at that. I think that just helps sort of validate everything that they've read. It kind of brings it to life a little bit. And that's kind of how we looked at it at that point. So we were very choosy into what we included into that backup support. But it was, at that point, it was really a matter of not having to go and chase it down. It was really a matter of what should we include.
Yeah, I think that's very well put, and describes a very thoughtful approach to developing those supplemental materials. So, you've submitted your 2-page summary and the 4 PDF sections online by the deadline, and it's probably best to start thinking about what happens next. So let's spend a minute or two on the judging process so that you know what the judges look for. There are 4 steps to the judging process. First, each judge individually reviews the 2-page summaries and the backup documentation. Then each judge rates the 4 steps on a 1 to 5 scale each. Each team member's rating for every entry are tabulated and averaged with the rest of the team. And this is important because it allows entries in each category to be ranked in order of the top vote getters. And the team can then discuss and debate the merits of the top vote getters to ensure that they agree on the placement of the entries. Finally, the team comes to a decision on a prestige winner in that category. And it may happen, though not particularly often, that the judges decide that there's no entry in a category that meets the prestige award standards, and therefore no award is given. It's important to note that the judges take their roles very seriously, and they review lots and lots and lots of entries and focus the most on the 2-page summary. And that is why we spend so much time going through that element of the entry, and why it's important to make your entry engaging, compelling, cohesive, and easy to read, and follow for the judges. Because put yourself in the judges' shoes with as many entries as they may have to review. It needs to be simple for them. Give them a reason to keep reading, if you will. To touch briefly on entering products, these are the judging criteria, and each are worth an equal amount. So planning and content, creativity and quality, technical excellence, and evaluation and results. And so really, I think those are, if you think about those, they're not significantly in some ways dissimilar from what we've described today, but a little bit more focused specifically on those individual tactics for obvious reasons. So, Mike, if there's anything that you've learned in this process to help others who are thinking of submitting an award, what would that be, or how might you encourage them to submit an entry for a prestige award?
Yeah, so there was two good learnings, I think, from this for us was, number one, when we began this whole campaign, it really was a small team. It was the Chief Communications Officer at Carnival Corporation, and it was me from the agency side, and we had one other person on the agency side who was just out of college. We did have, each of the brands have their own public relations function, and they were doing stuff on their own. But from a corporate standpoint, it was really, 3 people. So, I don't think anybody should feel like if they don't have, a big corporate communications team or a big agency team, that their work may not, be able to stand up against entities that have a lot of people. You know, so I think that, you know, everybody should feel like if they've done have a great body of work, regardless of the size of their team, that they have a legitimate chance. Also, you know, as part of that, as you know, Bobby, the Silver Anvils will have breakdowns in some of the categories for sizes of companies. So, you know, we were entered in, because of Carnival Corporation size, we were in the largest category for brand and reputation management and crisis communications. But if you were with a smaller organization, you could be in the same category, but competing against people of your, you know, that are of equal or lesser size. So I think that, you know, that's always good to know. And then the other thing is, if you have a campaign that's focused heavily on media relations, earned media, and social media, you don't necessarily have to have a big budget. So, you know, it's just sort of you have a good plan in place and you establish your goals, and then after that, it's just a matter of really trying to hopefully having a good story to tell, and good spokespeople, which is obviously very, very important. And at Carnival, we were very fortunate to have a very charismatic CEO and other very good spokespeople. So if you have those sorts of things in your favor, you don't necessarily need a big budget, and you can still do really good work. And you can have a chance against others who may have bigger budgets. So those are two of the things that we came out of that with, Bobby.
That's great, Mike. I think those are all really excellent points to cover and kind of put a wrapper on the content that we've covered today. Before we close, I do want to underscore that the Prestige Awards Committee is always happy to answer questions. So if you have any questions about an entry, whatever they may be, whether it's about the call for entries, whether it's about how you might package something that you've got, if you need, some reaction or whatever it is you may need, please feel free to submit those questions anytime to awards@prsatampa.org. We'd love to hear from you. So a couple of final points to wrap up here. Go to prsatampa.org and under the awards section and take a look at the call for entry. Review it very closely. It's full of great tips and entry instructions. It is an extremely thorough document. There's also, as I mentioned before, a repository of past Silver Anvil winning 2-page summaries on the PRSA National website, and it is great for reviewing and for ideas. It's just such a wealth of knowledge and great resources on there to take advantage of. And so with that, I'll thank everyone for joining today. And Mike, thank you so much for sharing all this great insight with us today. And I just want to wish good luck to everyone in this year's PRSA Tampa Bay Prestige Awards. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby.